The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, Huskies, and welcome to our first installment of Elevate Career Hacks Online. My name is Joshua Prue, and I'm the Director of Alumni Engagement for the Office of Alumni Relations here at UConn, and I'm going to be your moderator today. For those of you who have participated in previous online sessions, welcome back. And for those of you joining us for the first time, welcome to the Career Hacks series. This series is the online version of our Elevate Your Career Next Level, which is our month-long initiative that has been ongoing this January across the country. So far, we've had 13 of 16 events nationwide and are wrapping up in-person series events this week with our online program today, our event in Boston tomorrow, and a panel discussion in Hartford, Connecticut on Thursday. So if you're in any of these areas and still want to take advantage of this great series, please feel free to join us by visiting UConnalumni.com to sign up for these events. The Career Hack series this year has 3 installments, and the next being February 19th and the final on April 10th. You can be sure to check these out at our online calendar at uconnalumni.com/events. Today's workshop features an annual staple to our series, and for many who have participated in our Elevate Your Career Next Level series nationally this month, features John Brady, President and Founder of Pro-Tem Partners, UConn Alumni's preferred resource for career and management consulting, who joins us from College Station, Texas today to give us some insight into what we can do when we encounter a professional or career setback. Before we begin, I just have a few housekeeping items I want to help make sure manage your participation today. There will be an opportunity to ask questions by typing them into the question toolbar on your control panel. Feel free to type these in as you think of them, and we'll address as many as we can throughout the presentation. Second, a survey will be sent to you in follow-up this week. We would appreciate any information you can, so please fill that out when you receive that and send us back what types of programs and insight that you might be looking for future series. The presentation will be recorded, so please visit our YouTube page at youtube.com/UConnAlumni sometime later this week to review and preview previous conducted sessions. Lastly, again, to be sure to check out our events calendar for upcoming Career Hack webinars, as well as our in-person events that you can find at uconnalumni.com/events. To introduce our presenter today, John Brady, or JB as his friends call him, is an executive coach, keynote speaker, and frequent media source on matters related to corporate and career performance. Mr. Brady's current and recent clients span the United States and the United Kingdom, including senior managers and executives at Goldman Sachs, GE, Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, Apple, Shell, Aramark, Hess, Southwest Airlines, AstraZeneca, Comcast, IBM, UBS, Thomson Reuters, and many more. Mr. Brady is a 25-year veteran of the education, banking, and technology sectors, with experience growing the talent of top-line revenue of startups, family-owned businesses, nonprofits, and Fortune 50 companies. Holds a Bachelor of Science degree in English Education and Master of Education degree in Leadership Training and Policy Studies, both from the School of Education at Boston University, and also holds a Master of Business Administration degree with concentrations in Marketing and International Business from the Olin Graduate School at Babson College. He was also recognized in 2006 as a distinguished alumnus from Babson College, and John's firm of Pro-Tem Partners has been working with and serving as the preferred resource of career and management consulting for the Office of Alumni Relations here at UConn since 2014. John, I know we've been seeing a lot of each other over the last couple of weeks across the country, but it's always good spending time with you and really looking forward to your insight today.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you, everybody. Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are joining us from. Glad you could join us again. If you're one of the handful of people I got to meet on the road, thanks so much for welcoming us as we've traveled the country. And this is a nice place for at least my involvement with Elevate to wrap up for the month. And if you happen to be one of those people that I promised to get back to on something, give me another business day or two while I recover from our weeks on the road. Today's topic, helping either yourself or others recover from a career setback, can cover an awful lot of territory, and in a webinar it's going to be really difficult to do the kind of justice that I would really like to, but I'm gonna do my best to try to balance enough high level that we reach as many different situations and scenarios as possible, but just detailed enough to give you at least a little something to run with. But one of the things that is always a little tricky about a topic like this is that there's a lot of nuance and variation in the types of setbacks that people experience and the problems they run into, depending on the kind of work that you're in, the sector that you work in, the other personalities that can be involved, the type of setback. Certainly some are a lot more difficult than others. I'm going to do my best with the time that we have here, but I add that disclaimer just so that when you think about your own questions, if you choose to ask questions, that more often than not, when I get questions in a public forum, even a live forum, I think frustrating answer for people can be that it depends, and it helps for me to have a little bit more information than what I'm often able to get at a high level to give really sound advice. So in generalities, when it comes to the Q&A part, I will do my best, but if there's a lot going on and a lot of pieces to it that you want to cover, it might just be easier to reach out to me offline or work through Josh to get in touch with me or whatever else. We'll make sure you have my contact information at the end. With that, we're just going to dive in. When people think of setbacks, there are two categories that I decided to cover today. There are probably others, but if I think about two buckets, there's multiple ways people will interpret the topic. One is when something big goes wrong in your job or at work and how to manage recovering from that. The other, of course, is when people are having trouble finding their next thing. They feel like their career has plateaued in some way. Maybe they've been passed over for a promotion. In whatever way, folks often find themselves kind of stuck at different points along the way. If it hasn't happened to you, I can almost guarantee that it will. And it's good to know not only how to help yourself, but help others. So I'm going to start with the first category, and then we'll jump into the other. Frequently, people will reach out to me for help when something's gone wrong at work, and that can take a number of different forms. Whether it's something that you were responsible for, but maybe not directly working on, maybe someone who is in your span of control or project for which you were responsible, but maybe not something that you specifically made an error on, or even if it was your mistake, something somehow goes terribly wrong, whether it's just a faux pas of some kind or a project that was really important and mission critical and somehow didn't go the way it was supposed to. To be transparent, I've had a couple of those in my own career, and to the extent I'm able to talk about those, I'm happy to, as well as with, in general senses, some of those that have come my way from a client standpoint. But diving right into the meat of this here, the biggest mistake that people make whenever anything goes wrong is they're in reaction mode first. And part of that is just being human. Most of us, unless we've specifically been trained otherwise, we're going to have some kind of emotional reaction that's usually more internal than external, although people often emote outwards as well. Usually whatever the immediate reaction is that you're feeling is probably not the best one. Depending on the critical nature of the problem and how urgent it really is, if you're in a position to take a deep breath and step back, it's probably the best thing. Ideally, if you can even take an overnight to kind of clear your head, that may not always be advised. Some things need to be communicated much more quickly than others. But as much time, whether that's a few seconds or a few minutes, remember that generally that fight or flight response that is a human response is probably not serving you well. There's a line from a Hollywood movie, The Edge, that stars Anthony Hopkins, where he's in a plane crash with a couple of colleagues, and they're stuck in the wilderness in Alaska. And he says, the reason most people die in the wilderness is they die of shame. They get wrapped up in wondering what ifs and how did I get myself into the situation and so forth, rather than doing the one thing that could save their own lives, which is thinking. And thinking gets compromised not because we're not responsible or intelligent, but because we are human after all. And it's natural to feel that flood of adrenaline and that cold sweat and the dread of, oh my God, how did this get to this point? So the first thing you really need to do is, as much as you can, doing whatever it is that works for you, try and take a step back and get into the zone that as a professional, people are expecting you to do, and that is kind of get yourself in, as, I don't know if calm is the best place, but necessarily, but at least into a place where you can think as clearly as possible and deal with exactly what's in front of you, assess the problem exactly as it is in front of you, rather than getting too many steps ahead of yourself, imagining that you're going to get fired, that somebody's going to be upset with you. You just don't want to catastrophize in your own mind, because that just makes matters worse. Once you do decide how you're going to respond, at least outwardly, to things beyond just getting information and whatnot, I usually suggest that people follow the Goldilocks rule. You don't want to go into things with your emotions running too hot, and you also don't want to seem too cool and too distant either, because folks might not get the sense that you fully appreciate the gravity of the situation. There's that middle, just right ground where your humanity shows through a little bit and there's a sense of urgency, but you don't want to create this contagion, because people above you, people who report to you, and peers, they're going to feed off of whatever energy you naturally give. Once you've had a sense to hopefully do that, at least as best as you're able, that brings you into assessing the problem and seeing what's going on. Usually folks start immediately sounding the alarm, and depending on the kind of work you're doing, it might make sense to sound the alarm first, but in 90% of cases, there isn't a true emergency. It's urgent, but not really something that where the difference of minutes really counts. If you can take a couple of minutes, or ideally even a couple of hours, to assess the problem and the impact of that problem, because when you start talking to other people, they're going to want to know at a high level what the situation is and what the ripple effects are. And if you can at least indicate that, that's going to give a lot more confidence to people that you report to, that you're already on it, and you have a sense, and they can have a sense of just how big this is or isn't. When people don't know the scope of the problem just yet, they will tend to have their emotional response, which is to assume the worst or fear the worst, and that's why you want to be in the strongest position possible to handle it. All of this, of course, is easier said than done. But if you have had the opportunity to do your assessment and get a sense of what the damage is, or at least a first cursory look of who and where and scope of impact, that's usually a good time to start informing leadership and any other people who need to know, the people who should know that something's coming. This is just so important from a trust standpoint. You never want your boss surprised by something, so you want to do that assessment kind of stage as efficiently as you can and as quickly as you can, and then making sure that people in positions of authority or others who can be impacted hopefully won't hear it from other people. I say others on your break glass list because if there are people in your organization whom you trust who can be good support agents for you, or partners, or even just people on your team who you need to lean on to start getting some sense of where the impact is, and maybe something goes out on an email distribution list that it shouldn't have internally or even externally, and there's a mistake in it, or something like that. It's a good idea to get a sense for what's gone out and what hasn't, and if there's any way to keep the thing from getting worse before it gets any larger, if it's still kind of a dynamic situation. Since we're assuming you've only done a first pass on assessment and a sense of whatever's gone on, this is where you want to, if it's applicable, take a deeper dive and see just how far things have gone. One of the dangers is that people do a cursory look at something and they think that they've kind of covered it all. And often it's a good idea to say we're pretty sure this is what went wrong and this is how big the problem is or could be. But it's always good and wise if you can, and if it's applicable, to get that double check and see if what you think went wrong really did. Because what will often happen is the first suspect And by suspect, I don't necessarily mean person, but whatever it is that could have been problem, an errant keystroke somewhere, something that wasn't set up or sorted correctly, some other glitch of some kind, something going wrong with the vendor, whatever it was. Sometimes whatever we think the first problem was really isn't it. It's often not root cause. So the sooner that you can get to that, the better, and it's why it's worth taking a second pass at it with a little bit more time. The people who are in position of authority know, the people who are directly impacted and need to know are in it. Hopefully you've got everybody having had their moment to freak out if they're going to, and then heads down on the problem. It used to be, for example, that for first responders, if there was a loud explosion or a big sound, immediately first responders would immediately, almost instinctively, as helpers, would go running toward it. And in a post 9/11 world, sometimes depending on the setting, there's now a sense to hold back just a little bit and take that extra little bit to assess the situation and to sense the security of the situation, because there's a danger that the first incident to happen could actually be a trap, leading people in to go and help, and then the secondary or primary event happens, causing even more damage. So there's a balance between responding, that's that reaction versus responding, kind of having enough time to look around you and see where things are at. If it's now at a point where you feel like you've got a pretty good handle on whatever it is that went wrong, now is time for that broader communication, whether it's to constituents, vendors, other employees, et cetera. Hopefully you've had some time to think through the messaging and how you need that to go. All of these steps, again, you want to balance that sense of urgency with moving too quickly. I like to think of it as all deliberate speed, where nobody's really stalling and keeping people in the dark longer than they need to. But the worst is when the information keeps coming out in drips. Throughout the communication process, and certainly once things begin to stabilize, for whatever it is that went south, you want to make sure that you own it. And people tend to have a hard time with this, understandably so, because there's a sense that if you don't point out that it was the vendor who screwed up or somebody in some other department who screwed up, it's that you could pay an ultimate price, which can absolutely happen. But what is really going to erode any hope of you recovering from this is when you fail to take ownership for whatever it was that happened. I'm assuming throughout all of this that this was something you could have at least influenced, if not controlled. More often than not, in this particular case, this is when something that you've done or missed, or an error that may be a very natural human thing to do, somehow went wrong. Any apologies that you make, you want them to be sincere, but do make sure you don't go over the top with them. I think there's a sense that folks need to kind of fall on their sword and overdo it. Understand that other people are going to be angry. Other people may not react in as healthy and as professional way, or even a leadership kind of way as they should. This is the part that you just kind of have to live through, and it stinks, but you have to just sort of absorb where they're at. You don't need to take abuse, certainly, but do understand that they're human as well. They're reacting. It's probably creating more work for them. They have their own concerns about whatever the problem is and how it's going to impact them. You apologize with real sincerity, owning the problem with some humility, but you apologize and you leave it at that. And then you focus on fixing and dealing with it and going forward. Folks seem to often go to extremes in these kinds of situations. You want to be going down the middle of the road as much as possible. Once you finally get a chance to come out the other side or be in the recovery phase of things, usually the first few hours or that first 24 hours is probably not the best time to do it, because you're probably still, no matter your best efforts, if you manage to get your emotions in check to handle the problem, most of us will start to really dwell and maybe even fall apart when we get home or we get in the car or we finally have that time alone. But whenever you can, with just a little bit of distance from things, that's usually when you can start doing your reflection and your debrief and being painfully honest with yourself. Depending on your personality, again, folks in my experience tend to go to extremes. Some will self-flagellate. It's almost like they just, can't stop beating themselves up enough over something, when in fact we're all human and we all have a lot of things that are going on, pulled in a lot of different directions, and we all screw up. We don't always prioritize the way we should. We make mistakes. And there's a balance between not going that far and being too quick to somehow blame other people and deflect just in your own inner dialogue. The only way that you're going to be able to stay on top of this and learn and lead and grow from it is if you're being as honest with yourself as possible. And both extremes seem to be the norm rather than folks going down the middle. Remember, there's only so much of this that can be taught, but especially in a knowledge-based economy, we're rewarded and we're expected to be professionals. And it's easy to act professional when things are pretty straightforward. It's hardest when the chips are down. This is what really determines whether you're ready to take on more. This is what people are relying for you on, and this is what you're going to need in order to get out of the situation, is to kind of stay that steady course. And earning back trust is something that's going to happen over time. If it's a place you've worked for a while, maybe you've already established that trust and this is an outlier. The last time I had a major screw up in a work situation, it was luckily in an environment where I had been long enough where my work was well known and there were far more wins than losses, and mistakes were certainly not the norm. So I had a lot of kind of political capital going into it, and as ugly as it was, I had that on the front end. But no matter what, there's going to naturally be a period where you kind of need to dig out of the hole that you're in, and that just means staying on top of things. If you were a little bit distracted, if things didn't go as well as they could have, if maybe you realized that a teammate or somebody that you trusted maybe more than I guess you can would be wise to do in the future, where you're going to need to double and triple check. Certainly if there are opportunities to focus on your next win and deliver on that win, the errors will fade sooner than you realize. Not as soon as you like, but they will fade to black sooner than I think most people expect. You'll often be in a position where, whether it's someone within your direct line of management, if you're in a leadership position, a management position, or just a peer, and you're going to have to help others. Assuming that it impacts you, you're on the team, or you're a manager, this should look familiar. Same kind of rule here. The only thing I added as far as the react versus respond is you need to be able to check your own emotional state and theirs. This is a really important teachable moment for people who report to you. They need to learn how to handle this stuff as leaders in their own right. They need to learn how to grow as professionals in their own right. And this is where that Goldilocks principle applies again. You don't want to lose your cool, but you don't want to seem too distant, like it's no big deal. They do need to feel the pressure to get things addressed as quickly as possible. But you also need to make sure that their head is in the right place. And if you need to give them a couple of minutes or some level of support to make sure that they're at least level-headed going into things so they don't make matters worse, it'll be a few minutes well invested. Take the time to stick your head in a pillow for your primal scream a little bit later if you can. You want to really teach them how to handle something like this. Whether they're in your reporting line or just a colleague, provide as much support as you can, but still let them own it and address it. I think some of us, particularly as leaders, when people are in pain, when something goes wrong, there's this desire to go in and fix it. And sometimes, number one, we can't, but it's not always the best thing to do. It's fine to give people a little bit of air cover, to say things like, hey, this person's usually really very good at what they do. I'm on top of it. I have a pretty good sense of what's going on. Or if it's a colleague, feel free to check in with them. The worst thing you can do is be that person who distances yourself from the individual as much as possible, fearful that like it's a contagion and you're going to catch it and be associated with them. That's really a highly unlikely occurrence. You want to be a helper in an organization. It's wise because someday you will be on the other side of it. And it's important, again, from a leadership perspective, that people learn how to fail and also how to take some level of responsibility and accountability within the organization and how to fix it. There might be some things that at their level they don't have access to, and they'll need you for that. But other than that, you provide just enough air cover so that nobody goes too crazy and immediately is starting to talk about termination or anything that's too harsh without having had time to see whether or not that's actually warranted. But beyond that, give them the opportunity to do it. It's an ugly rite of passage, but it's the only way that one group of managers can eventually learn how to lead and help another. I know I was in a situation where, while it wasn't exactly my doing, it was something I was responsible for. Something happened within an area for which I was the senior person and therefore accountable just by virtue of my position. And we had a really ugly mess on our hands, and it was a financial one. And I was really fortunate that people from other departments whom I had helped in a number of different ways actually came in with their own budget money to help fix the gap and correct the problem, which was something I never would have expected. And it went a long way. As an organization, we came together, and it was good of people to do that because they didn't have to. Resources are always really tight. And we came out the other side. It all worked out nicely. This is also the same as the other side. You want to assess the problem and the damage to you if it impacts your department, your organization, your function, and certainly if this is something that happened within your reporting line, you want to make sure that the person who is owning it and addressing it knows how to assess the problem, knows what to look for. They may not, in their race and their scramble to get to good graces again, be thinking about all of the potential impacts. And it's your job to think a few steps further out, second, third degree kinds of things that, they may be too junior to understand the way things ripple through an organization and the sort of if-then statements that happen further downstream. And if so, you want to make sure you're pointing those out, kind of coaching them through how to handle that. If there's a need, if you're more in middle management, it happened within your group, if there's a need to inform more executive leadership, certainly make sure that you do that. Generally speaking, I'm assuming in this case that since this wasn't exactly your something that was your mistake, but rather something on your team, just kind of letting them know that the blip happened, that you're on it, scope and where we're at. You'll find that 9 times out of 10, the senior most leadership is just going to say, okay, good, and they're going to move on to the many other problems that are coming to them. Most problems come to them without a filter, without someone having done all this work already. So if you can do that, you'll find that generally you've been able to provide enough air cover for the person on your team who's dealing with the worst of the crisis, and in a sense you're also demonstrating that you know how much information to share without getting too bogged down with concerns that they don't need to be. And then just make sure you follow up accordingly. Do make sure, even if this is presuming it was in your span as opposed to a peer or just a colleague with whom you don't have any direct sharing of the project, the issue, the problem, whatever. If this is something in your area, do make sure that you still take accountability for it. And this is different from owning it. The person who's probably the most to blame is the person who really needs to own the problem. But as a leader, you do need to take accountability for it, which is all the things that I listed above. But at the same time, people really value leaders who do that because sadly, it's so uncommon. The finger pointing starts, or there's a deflection, or a sense that, well, if this hadn't happened and then that thing hadn't happened, just kind of bad luck. Remember, your job as a leader is to try and anticipate and help your people anticipate things that could potentially go wrong, including things that are outside of your control. So you still want to take whatever level of accountability, but you don't want to own too much of the problem. It's not really good for you. It usually isn't going to help the person who's at the root of everything, but it's really, really uncommon to see someone who knows how to do that and do it well. And it's very refreshing. You'll find that people are much more comfortable reporting to you. They are much less likely to keep things from you. And management much prefers that, whether management is people higher ranking than you, or even if you're at the very top of the organization and your boss is a board of directors, that level of accountability is really important. It's also really important for any other stakeholders inside or outside the organization that you may need to communicate with, because that may be something that should not come from somebody junior. It may have to come from you. Wanting to do that well is going to be really critical for your success. And then at that point, again, people don't always know how to do this. Focus on the post-mortem and the real detail. How did we get here? What went wrong? That's as much about the employee or employees involved as well as whatever could have been learned about systems, process, relationships with vendors, with customers, whatever. Learn what you can from it. Make sure that you're modeling as much as possible the sense of understanding about how to do that and do it well. Generally, people want to keep their heads down and hope that nobody notices, hope that it's over. The last thing people want to do is open the wound again. But if it's in a healthy, productive way, getting everybody involved to focus on the problem and not the people is going to be the right thing to do. Even in the ugliest of situations, if someone did something they really shouldn't have and it's truly an offense that warrants termination, that's going to happen anyway. But you want to focus people's attention on learning as much as they could have, because while there may have been one person who could have handled something better, more often than not, there's a cluster of factors that tend to contribute to something going wrong. And you want to show that leadership and that discipline of learning from it. Otherwise, I promise you it'll happen again, and probably sooner than you'd like it to. And it won't go over as well the second time as it did the first. And if this is somebody, whether they're a peer or they report to you, doesn't matter. Assuming that this person hasn't been consistently just demonstrating that they're irresponsible, we're all human. You want to give people an opportunity to redeem themselves. Again, use your judgment in deciding whether or not someone's ready for that. Maybe you give back certain pieces of responsibility or opportunities sparingly, but do give them. Not just because it's the right thing to do. It's really inefficient to have somebody who's permanently labeled the screw up because of one thing that went wrong. People need to dig out of it. I remember when I had first started driving, was in my first car accident. The first thing my parents did a few hours later, it was a minor accident, but was make me drive. And that was probably not what they wanted, was me to be behind the wheel again. And I was honestly still kind of shaken up from the whole thing. It wasn't what I wanted to be doing, but they knew how important it was that I not permanently associate that mistake or get unnecessarily nervous because it would likely cause more problems. Remember, this at some point could be you or is going to be you. You want to, if it seems in your judgment the right thing to do, you want to give people a chance to shine again. Because when they get that first win, and then especially that second win, whatever screw up happened, no matter how big, is going to start to fall back in people's memories as just a one-off. In terms of second category, I talked a little bit about what happens when something major goes wrong at work, but what about broader career setbacks? You know, your career has stalled, you've gotten passed over for a promotion that you really believe was yours to be had, or maybe just you're having trouble finding your next thing. Maybe you got caught up in a layoff that had nothing to do with you, but you're having a hard time getting to the next thing. Whenever, and maybe this is related to a screw up that happened. Sometimes they're one and the same, but not always. really important to assess your situation fully and honestly. If you're sensing a theme, there's a reason. I always want people to kind of check in with themselves first. Same thing, ownership, own your own situation. I think we tend to look at what wasn't fair, those things that happened to us. I'm not suggesting that you are always at fault for a career setback, for a layoff, for even getting fired necessarily. Often it is because of other people. We work in toxic places. We have leaders who aren't always very good at what they do. They may not even have integrity. But if you get stuck too much in the what should be versus what is, you're really not dealing with the problem. And when I say own your situation, own the fact that your career is your responsibility and nobody else's. It's wonderful that places like UConn, coaches like myself and others in your network want to help you, but no one else is responsible for your success other than you. I have seen people recover from some really ugly things, even having done things that were downright not just irresponsible, but wrong. Like that got them even into some criminal trouble and had to figure out how to still come out the other side and support their families. It is easy to just paint somebody like that as permanently somebody who's broken, but the fact of the matter is most folks need to find a way to support their families and recover from doing something like that. And I've seen them do it successfully, which means whatever has happened to just about anybody on this webinar or who would listen to this webinar is probably going to be not nearly as serious as that. It's easy to get wrapped up in problems of it's just so hard to break through. Companies won't get back to me. That ageism is the problem or other things. That's not to suggest those aren't factors, but even if there are other things going on in the workplace, even if you were treated unfairly, even if the bottom did fall out of a particular market or a company went under through no fault of yours, even if you do find yourself struggling with being mid or even later career and trying to break into places, it's still your problem to solve. It's not necessarily your fault, but if you don't fully own and embrace your situation, you can't get out of it. When people come to me for help with this, and I do this often, one of the things I'm assessing when I have a consult with them is how realistic are they about their own situation? Because if they're not, I can't help them. And once I know that they're in a good place and that they at least, and by a good place I mean that they get it, that sense of ownership and accountability for getting out of it is really, really empowering, and what will help you break through whatever it is that's gotten you stuck, even if it's just that your career, which had been like going like a rocket, kind of just plateaued for a little while. Make sure you've got a survival plan that you actually document, whether it's pen to paper or electronically. The panic sets in for a lot of folks, and if not panic, they start believing that they can't get out of their stall, that they can't get out of the situation that they're in. I often remind people that there's a lot of power to halftime psychology, since it's still football and Super Bowl season. You know, being up or down when you go into the locker room at halftime there's a lot of momentum in there, and it's it tends to be self-perpetuating. So if you feel like a victim, if you feel like a failure, or even if you just feel panicked because you're moving in so many directions that you're worried about being able to pay the mortgage or make the kids' tuition payment, you're not able to solve the problem because that fight-flight thing is back in there, or that negative narrative is where you're stuck. This is more in the realm of psychology than in my domain, but get whatever help you need to make sure that you've got yourself in a place of understanding, not just emotionally, but also practical stuff. If you need to look at your finances in a very hard and maybe even painful way, know exactly what your runway is, know when you've got to kind of come up with some kind of backup plan, whether that is something really in the extreme in terms of moving or unloading the house, or maybe aiming lower than you should be for for jobs, whatever it is, that just so that you can have that peace of mind of knowing that no matter what happens, you have a plan to keep yourself from true crisis. It'll make it a lot easier for you to get out of where you're at and get to your next thing. If you have the time to do this, not everybody does. Whether it's a layoff situation, if you're financially in a position to do this, it's a good idea to take a little bit of a break, not necessarily an extended sabbatical, just a little bit of room, and the amount of time is going to vary based on your situation. But if you get laid off on a Friday, I think there's a tendency to go right into planning mode over the weekend and action by Monday. That may not be the best thing to do if you are realistically in a safe place once you've had a chance to see how serious things are. And if you are just in a situation where you're working but your career is kind of stalled, give yourself a little bit of time to step back and reflect. Whether you do that with a resource like myself or something you do on your own, it's best to kind of clear the deck and clear your head a little bit, because very often there's a difference between our instincts and our impulses, and our instincts can often serve us very well, our impulses not so much. It gets back to that responding versus reacting again. If you can take just a little period, if you haven't, and if you've been trying, searching, usually people will say they've plateaued because they've been in some sort of active job search, or they've been trying to get that promotion, and the proverb, nothing changes if nothing changes, holds true. They haven't stepped back from anything, and the more you keep grinding your gears, the more emotionally and just physically exhausted and fed up you're getting, as opposed to getting anywhere. And to the extent it's humanly possible, do whatever you need to do to kind of focus elsewhere, not in an effort of avoidance, but just to kind of clear the decks a little bit and not get stuck in doing the same thing over and over again. Try to remember that even if you've been terminated, if you're long-term unemployed, if you work for the same place for decades and now you're making your first foray back into the workforce but somewhere else, or even if you got let go because something went terribly wrong, like we talked about in the first segment, remember that there is really no difference between this and any other job search. I think people sort of feel like they're in another category when this happens. When you go through a job search, I tell every client, rejection is the norm. You're going to get rejected by the majority of places that you apply to, and even the majority of places that you interview with, just because those numbers are a natural part of the process. Usually salespeople are really good about this kind of thing, but others of us not so much. We tend to take it very personally. You're not entitled to anything. No job is yours. People start almost imagining themselves in the role before they have it. And I don't mean in the healthy way when they're trying to interview and imagine how they would respond as they think about trying to demonstrate their proficiency and their knowledge. They just, they start to feel like they've got something to lose. And once that happens, it's a lot more likely that you will feel defeated when you get rejected. So I wouldn't go in expecting a rejection, but I would go in ready for that, knowing that just the numbers aren't going to necessarily work in your favor. You're going to get tough questions from interviews, especially if something went wrong from your previous employer. But even if you don't, we all get that question about where we could develop, no matter how it's worded. And right now, the more common question that prospective employers are asking is, tell me about a time something went really, really wrong in your career and what you did. Not everyone's actually had that opportunity. So if you do have that opportunity now, well, I wouldn't quite call it a gift. At least now you know what you'll talk about. But the advice I see online, I think it's the wrong advice, is to try and frame a negative as a positive. Most people are smart enough not to fall for that. And I don't think it's very authentic and gets people to trust you. You do want to be ready for those tough questions. So I'm not a fan of spin. But I think truth, while important, doesn't mean you have to divulge everything. There's a difference between acknowledging that a project didn't end up where you wanted it to be, and this is what happened, this is where we went. But there's a tendency to overshare rather than that kind of middle ground, and letting people know just what they need to know, that responds to the question, that gives people a sense of scope and scale, but also how you manage to recover from it, or how you coached others to respond to it. I'm blanking right now on a good example of this, but a variation on this, which is not a tough question, but I think just a workplace, telling the truth versus sharing too much. It's one thing to say, I have a medical appointment I have to go to. It's something else to share that you're going to a therapy appointment or a urology appointment, or just something that's private and personal to you that requires no additional explanation or elaboration. You tell the truth, you give them what they need to know, you answer, and you move on. That takes some practice. And if you need help, reach out to somebody who's really good at interviewing, which sometimes is an HR person, might be somebody like myself, could be a number of people, but it's good to run it through with a few people. I'm not a fan of scripting too much, but you want to be ready for that question. That's an answer you want to be rehearsed, but not so rehearsed that it sounds like you're just reading from a script. Rehearsed enough that it comes off somewhat conversational. And if you can't break out of the stall, if you're finding that you're just kind of in the same place over and over again, look for well-qualified and well-vetted help. I'm here, Josh mentioned that I serve as the preferred provider for UConn's alumni. Reach out. I spend a good deal of time with UConn alums. Sometimes a consult is all that they need. I'm not a fan of making consultations sales pitches and feeling like, a timeshare sales pitch. I really just am in an effort to help people as much as I can, and if I can give them what they need in a conversation of 30, 60, 90 minutes, whatever it is, I'm happy to do that. There are points where it does make sense to get some help, but because this is not exactly a regulated line of work, you want to get some recommendations from people. Certainly in this case, I have a relationship and have for a number of years with the university. I'm not the only resource out there, but check references, see whether or not somebody's worked with folks in your situation before, see what their track record is, how well they're known, the kinds of places that do know them, the kinds of sectors that they've helped people in before. It's just good to be a wise consumer, but you do at some point maybe want to invest in some help. It's funny that people will spend so much on their tuition and their certifications and everything, and then they never pay for help again. Unfortunately, most companies aren't investing as much money in training and development dollars as they used to. I talked about owning your situation. Your career belongs to you, and you want to make sure that you're getting help along the way. And luckily, UConn thinks beyond most institutions in wanting to be as supportive as it can be, no matter what age or stage you're at in your professional life. So all of the programming things through Elevate that they're doing, the engagement with me and the programs that I do and the one-on-one work I do with people, is there for a reason, so that you at least have some place to call. If you do end up reaching out for help from somebody as a paid resource, make sure that they have references from past or current clients. I'm assuming someone who isn't already associated with the university like I am. They should have a code of ethics that they are willing to share, and I would certainly hope that they follow them. Their fee structure should be non-ambiguous and not the kind of thing that is a bait and switch where you start to feel like, they're becoming embedded in your life and annuitizing you as a client. That starts to feel more like a parasitic relationship than a helpful one. Hopefully there's some real clarity around where their work begins and ends. They should be pretty well networked in at least related disciplines. It doesn't have to be all these on the board, but the more embedded they are, the more you get a sense of whether this is someone who's just kind of hanging out a shingle and doing this as a side hustle versus somebody who is constantly learning and taking this stuff seriously. Even if it's not somebody like me, they should be willing to have a consultation with you that is substantive and where they're willing to be very transparent with you and not just use the entire time as a sales opportunity for themselves. We do need to support ourselves because we're not usually on a payroll of some kind, and there's nothing wrong with that. But their focus should be on supporting you, and trust your gut. If you feel like they merit your trust, that's a good start. If you don't feel comfortable or feel safe, then don't go there and look for another resources. And generally speaking, be wary of various guarantees that folks who are in the executive and career coaching business make. Most of your outcome is going to be determined by you, your employer, and other factors, as opposed to the person that you retain, the person that you hire. There are a lot of different situations that will arise. I realize that the advice I gave here is, I don't know if I'd call it perfect world. It fits in a lot of imperfect worlds, because certainly the places I've worked have not been perfect, and where my clients have worked have not been perfect. But more often than not, it does. I do understand that there are toxic places. There are bosses who will look for any way to make things difficult, to micromanage. Human beings take all their brokenness into the organizations that they serve and that they lead. And while we should expect more from leaders, they have their shortcomings, and some people just don't belong in management. And I acknowledge that many end up in those situations. And if that's happened to you, then that's one of those, it depends situations, and something that should probably be discussed offline. There's also a lot of nuance to this. Folks who are having trouble breaking through whatever situation that they've had in their job search, there's seldom a one-size-fits-all answer, and those are good things to either bring to my attention or to others. If you're a more recent undergrad or graduate, Josh can speak to this, but the university's career services office is a team of truly great people, and they're there for you for the first 3 years after you leave the institution. After that, they can help a little bit, but only so much, and that's then where I come in, and others. But lean on your alumni network as well. I have found that the UConn community is a true community of helpers, and most of the people you reach out to will help you to the extent they possibly can. My contact information is right up there on the screen, email as well as phone numbers. Feel free to use those if you need to reach out to me directly for anything, and I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. Josh, I'm going to turn it over to you for any questions or to wrap.
Thanks very much, John. Greatly appreciate your insight. Obviously, as John mentioned, he's available to all of our alumni, provides a 60 to 90-minute consultation at no charge. So if you are looking to kind of get some more specifics, be sure to reach out to John at his contact information there. Now's really the time we'll open it up for questions. I haven't seen too many come through at this point. As I say that, then they come through. So let's see what we got here. If there is a negative perception about staying in one position or with one employer for too long, do you have any advice on framing that?
There can be, depends on the industry that you're in. If you're an early career professional, it's certainly not uncommon to have jumped around a little bit. And too long depends. I don't know necessarily what you mean. Generally speaking, and again, this is very, very general, the 5 to 7 year window seems to be the magic. There are exceptions to that. The number one exception is a situation where you've had pretty progressive responsibility. If you've been getting a number of promotions and you've been doing really well, stretching that out to 10 years, maybe even a little more, is certainly understandable. If you haven't had any more than maybe one promotion, or maybe even none, anything more than that 7 year thing can start to get to be a little bit. If you've had 3, 4, 5 moves up, you can run into a little bit of question about, despite your success, whether or not you only know how to work in one organization. But generally, that's a position of strength to go into. It can be very challenging when you're in the 15, 20, 25, and even 30 year kind of situations, and that's something that is probably best covered offline. But overall, I think the reason most people stay in a job is a very positive reason. And in terms of framing things, It's as long as you were able to continue learning, they were willing to continue giving you additional responsibility. Even if that didn't mean a change of title or promotion, odds are pretty good that your job wasn't exactly the same. It probably evolved over time. And I focus on all of those things, the learning, the growth, the reasons why it's worked for you. And you need to be really clear about why you're looking to make a change, because presumably it's to continue that, to continue learning, to continue growing. If there's just no place to go, it could be for practical reasons. There are a lot of reasons why people suddenly want to make a change after being in an organization for a long time. It's usually not a negative, but admittedly, as evidenced by the fact that you asked it, it can be a little bit of an issue. But I tend to focus on all of the things that have made it wonderful and why you just want to make sure you find a place that can be wonderful in a similar or related way. And anything more concrete and, quite frankly, more compelling than that, I need to know more.
Thank you very much, John. Next question coming in. What's the best advice you could give somebody if their stumbling block is their desire for an industry change despite having transferable skills?
Ooh, I get this a lot. And I think our very first webinar that we did together was on a similar topic. I love to talk about the difference between transferable skills and transferable impact. And what I mean by that is the organizations that post positions and even hiring managers, they think they're looking for transferable skills, and they will search for transferable skills, if not someone who's already in the same line of work. But when you want to make a change, your human connections and networking will be the most impactful. And the reason it is most impactful is because you can get into a substantive discussion about what your transferable impact could be. What do I mean by that? It's one thing to know that you're very good at managing projects or events or data analysis or any one of a number of skills that are infinite. But what is a really compelling story, particularly if you're changing careers, odds are pretty good that you've got at least some experience, if not even mid to late career. You want to talk more about the why. All those things that you did resulted in what. And it is a little harder to do when you come in cold through an application process. But if you're reaching out to people and networking about an industry that you want to break into, if you can talk more about the results, even qualitative results, things that changed the culture of an organization, the general ease with which things started to function, or simplifying things that aren't always easily quantified. People in positions of leadership will naturally start to think, hey, she or he can do that there. They could do something like that here. And in order to do that, you need to understand a little bit about their business model and their industry. As Josh and I have been traveling around the country for Elevate, I would often start those that were more panel discussion oriented, talking about the industry and the business and revenue models for a company, because that enables you to tell that story, to tell a story about how what you have done in one place can be directly applicable to whatever it is they need and whatever it is they're doing. That usually has to be with senior management to executive level people in order to be successful. But with my clients who are in that situation, that's exactly where I spend my time, is finding the people to talk to who are right and trying to make sure the discussion fits that more impact focus. It makes it a lot easier to make the switch. HR people, frontline hiring managers focus on skills. People with P&L responsibility and higher, they tend to think about results and impact, and that's transferable just about anywhere because it's the stuff you can't teach.
Thanks, John. And we have time for one more question. Apologies to those others that came through. We will actually continue on if John's got a few extra minutes, but I know in wrapping things up, generally we try to keep to the 1 o'clock time frame. But John, this one came through. Are there any thoughts about using self-promotion through social media, networking tools, primarily if you think about LinkedIn, to not only make people aware of the situation, and this person indicates, let's just assume layoff, but also to advertise that you're seeking new opportunities in whatever field or whatever area you might be looking at. So, for example, making a post within a particular LinkedIn group, expanding one's reach, something to that effect to seek help more rapidly.
As far as a platform like LinkedIn or most of the things that are most of the social media platforms, my thinking is usually, generally speaking, within a group, I might share, within a LinkedIn group, I might share that I'm looking, or, whether that's through, an alumni group or an industry or trade group or something like that. I tend to not. There are exceptions to everything, but generally, what I do avoid is asking people to change like their headline on something like LinkedIn to that they're looking for an opportunity. And while I know the question was more broad than LinkedIn, since LinkedIn is the real ubiquitous platform for searching for talent, it's really basically a search engine for talent. Your headline and your summary really needs to be about what you do. Because wish to be doing, because when recruiters and other people are searching for you, they're searching for you based on function, not the fact that you're unemployed and looking for work. So while that is out there as advice, it's not advice I happen to agree with. But I don't think you need to be shy about the fact that you're looking for work, because if somebody looks in the experience section and they see when you stop working someplace, it's going to be pretty self-evident. So there's no shame in the fact that you're looking for work, and I think you can put it out there. I just wouldn't make that your brand, because whether it's in your headline or your summary or anywhere else in the public domain, if you're to use something, like a Facebook platform, and you're not sharing publicly, but strictly to a select group of friends, or even colleagues, because I know that line overlaps for a lot of us on social media, totally okay. But you don't want your brand to be unemployed. You want your brand to be your area of function and subject matter expertise. But never be shy about letting people know that you're looking for your next thing, that you want to reach out and learn more about what they're doing. And while it's easier said than done, still try to be as much of a helper as you can when you're in that situation. Even if it's been long-term, folks will help other helpers. There's a point where it gets harder to go back to the well for people asking them over and over again. When you're trying to stay top of mind so that they don't forget that you're looking for a role, you want to make sure that you're not making it all about you, but there's nothing wrong with letting people know more than once even that you're still looking and what you're looking for, or if your focus has changed, letting them know what it is. It's like a billboard. You want to keep reminding people. The better thing sometimes to do is be sharing and posting as much generally as you can on social media, and if not there, just generally having good communication and contact with your contacts while you're looking, so they remember that you're there, rather than, again, kind of permanently branding yourself as somebody who's out, because that doesn't communicate what your value is. And Josh, I can handle more questions if we want to let, obviously, people go because we're over time, or I can take them offline and respond to them electronically, however you want.
Sure. No, I appreciate that, John. In the essence of time, what I'd like to suggest is that there are a couple of questions that have come through. They look like they may require a little bit of a lengthy or more personalized response. So what I would say is, if you can, take the information about John's contact here, email him these questions, jb@protempartners.com, get those over to him, and that way it's a little bit more personalized in that process at this moment. So that being said, John, I would like to thank you for your time today, for your time throughout the country, approximately 10 cities over the last month, and we can't thank you enough for all of that. Folks, if you do have questions for John, please make sure you go ahead and get in touch with him, and be sure to sign up for our next Career Hack presentation, which will be next month. You can see that information about personal branding, so somebody that was just talking about that on LinkedIn, you can make sure you get some information there. The personal brand introductions with one of our own alumna, Paula Calise, who operates a firm actually quite close to John in the Dallas, Texas area, who will be joining us for that presentation. So make sure you sign up for that next month in February. And John, again, thanks again for everything. Thank you all for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Take care, everybody.